Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a quick little reaction video to Sword of Truth and Justice. Now, I say quick, but whenever I try to do a short and quick video, I always end up talking for about an hour and 20 minutes and need to find a way to cut it down to like 15 or 20 minutes. Hashtag YouTuber problems. Anyway, we're going to try to keep this one nice and short. So, Sword of Truth and Justice, I was pretty excited when I woke up and saw this thing this morning. Like many of the swords before it, it's 3 to cast, 2 to equip, and it says, equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from white and from blue. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, then proliferate. So, pretty cool little equipment. And in my opinion, it's a bit different than some of the ones we've seen before it. Now, my very first reaction to this sword was that they're continuing the cycle. And that's what had me really excited, because I never thought that they would actually finish doing this cycle, because to me, I had spent some time thinking about it, how you would do it, and it just seemed like a really hard cycle to complete. In my opinion, all of the other swords were enemy colors and flavor-wise opposites from one another. To me, it just seemed harder to do sort of similar concepts and to do a full cycle of those. But we did end up with Sword of Truth and Justice, so it does look like they are going to do that cycle. So like I said, my very first reaction was just, they're continuing the cycle, yeah. And yesterday, as a matter of fact, before seeing this card, I was actually just thinking to myself that, like, it would be cool to see some new equipments. We haven't really seen a lot of new cool equipments over the past few years. Every so often, one sneaks in, you get a Sword of the Animist, you get a Dowsing Dagger. While those cards do help you set up and get your early game going, they aren't these big, sexy equipments that hit really hard and really, you know, make you want to go out and buy a bunch of packs, that kind of thing. So yeah, I was just thinking that, like, it would be cool to see some new equipment soon, and it looks like we're getting some new equipments. Anyway, my next reaction after thinking about this for a little bit. In the previous cycle, each of the abilities is very clear to which color it's associated with, and I really don't feel like that's the case on Sword of Truth and Justice. I actually feel like it's maybe a little bit misplaced. Proliferate is typically a blue ability, so that's the blue half of the card, makes sense. +1/+1 counters are not a thing in white. There are so few white cards that really deal with +1/+1 counters. +1/+1 counters are very much like a green-black Sultai. White really is not a +1/+1 counter color. The only two cards I can even really think of off the top of my head in white that care at all about +1/+1 counters are like Sunscorched Regent and Cathar's Crusade, but I really can't think of any others. So, honestly, this probably should have been blue and green. We already have a blue and green sword, that's body in mind. But the abilities don't really feel blue and white to me, they feel blue and green. So to me, I thought that that was a little bit of a miss on this card. Mechanically, if I were going to try to execute this card as a really blue and white card, I would have thought about something like the Ice ability where you tap a creature down and it doesn't untap. And then the white half would be like put a 2/2 Knight into play, or you could do the inverse, where the white half would be like put a Pacify counter on a creature, that creature can't attack or block, and then the blue half could be something like Scry 3. I think either of those would feel a lot more blue and white than this current iteration does. But again, that kind of brings me back to my surprise that they're actually doing this cycle, because I have thought about it. These do seem like really hard cards to pull off. So yeah, right there, as far as flavor and mechanics matching up, I feel like they did miss the mark a little bit on this one. Hopefully the other ones will be a little bit more in line to the swords that we've seen in the past in terms of flavor and function. But all of that aside, do I think this card's going to be good? What decks do I think it will see play in? And how does it compare to the other swords? First up, I don't think it'll be as good as Feast and Famine. Sword of Feast and Famine is insane. That is an insanely powerful magic card, especially in Commander. In 60 card formats, some of the other swords gain a bit more value. Fire and Ice becomes a little better. Even Light and Shadow, War and Peace can do some work in 60 card formats because of the 20 life total. But for Commander, Feast and Famine is really the best, I think. And that's based on all of the many games that I've played using equipment decks. When I get like mid to late game and I'm thinking about which equipments I want to tutor for, like if I have Sunforger already, Feast and Famine is probably the next thing that I'm going to, because Feast and Famine really allows you to do some broken stuff in Commander. And I also don't think it's going to have that same like wide level of application. You can put Sword of Feast and Famine in like any Commander deck and it's going to be pretty good. Even if it doesn't care about equipments, doesn't care that much about attacking, Feast and Famine's just going to be a good card all of the time. So, tangents aside, Sword of Truth and Justice is going to be a bit more narrow in its application, but I think it's actually going to be deceptively good. I wasn't super impressed with it the first time I read it, but as I started going through this more, I was actually really surprised about how much damage it can dish out, as well as some of its other applications. I think where this card's going to see some play is going to be your Atraxa decks, it's going to be your +1/+1 counter decks, any deck that wants to proliferate, any deck that's running a Thrumming Bird in it. So that's going to be your +1/+1 counter decks. It's going to be your Super Friends decks. If you're randomly trying to pull off like a charge counter deck, something like that. It is cool that it opens up Proliferate in colors that don't necessarily have Proliferate. So for example, there was a minute where I was messing around with a Red-White Super Friends deck. Haven't shown that one on the channel yet, but I plan to do it at some point. This would be a good inclusion in that deck, so giving Proliferate to colors that wouldn't have it normally could open up some really interesting avenues. Now what about Combat and Voltron-based decks? I sort of have mixed feelings about it. On the surface, it doesn't really blow me away, but as I started thinking about it, for me being an Aurelia player, what happens if you put this thing on Aurelia? And actually, the results are better than I expected they would be. So if you equip this on Aurelia, you're going to hit for 5 damage the first time, it's going to get 2 counters on it. So then when you go to second combat, you'll hit for 7. That's 12. That means in 2 turns, Sword of Truth and Justice by itself is actually lethal on a single player in an Aurelia deck. Commanders with Double Strike will essentially operate similarly to how Aurelia operates. So, actually by itself, it's really not that bad. You make Aurelia or any Double Strike commander pretty huge after just 1 turn. So that's something to think about. And also, before I get too far along, the protection colors are really relevant. You're protecting yourselves from Swords and Path, and Rapid Hybridization, Pongify, 2-mana mode on Cyclonic Rift, and Reality Shift. Those are some really big things to protect yourself from. So the colors of protection on this thing are really good. But actually, yeah, initially the ability doesn't blow me away, but like when you start thinking about the math, you will kill people very quickly if you're playing a Voltron deck with either Double Strike or Double Combats. So then let's take the next step. When you play an Aurelia deck, the next thing you want to do is get Double Strike. Now this is going to get a little bit awkward because something like Duelist Heritage isn't going to work with Sword of Truth and Justice, which is a little bit of a sad face, because you can't target the attacking creature because of the protection from white. However, if you had a True Conviction or a Silverblade Paladin in play, and you can give Aurelia Double Strike, here's what the math is going to look like. First combat, first hit is going to do 5 damage. You're going to get 2 counters. Second hit in that first combat is going to do 7 damage. That's 12. And you're going to get 2 more counters. Now your power's up to 9. So you go to second combat, you hit for 9. And that's actually lethal against the single player right there in terms of commander damage. It'll go up to 11 power. And then I think on MTGO, it still lets you get the last hit in, which I don't think it's actually supposed to do. But, theoretically, if they survive all of that, Aurelia would have 13 power by the end of both combats and both double strikes. That actually sets this apart from the other swords, because the other swords with double strike are not lethal by themselves on an Aurelia or any 3-power commander. You need some other card to pump the power in some way. So that's actually pretty legit that this sword with double strike on an Aurelia actually kills significantly faster than the other swords do. One of the big problems with War and Peace is that all that extra damage is not commander damage. If it were, War and Peace would be significantly better than it is currently. Still not a bad card though. So Truth and Justice, even though it didn't initially blow me away in terms of like Voltron and combat decks, it actually turns your creature really big really quickly. So that is something to think about. If you just want to go pure Voltron, make the biggest thing on board, it will make your creature bigger. One interesting difference between the other swords, though, is that the other swords generate value for you. This one does not appear to generate value in the same way that the other ones do, but if you're doing the Voltron thing, it'll generate crazy amounts of damage, more than the other swords will, at least in terms of commander damage. So in comparison with the other swords, there are times in the game when you want to generate value, but there are also times where you just need people dead. You need to get them out of the game because you know if they untap, bad things are going to happen. Another interesting comparison for the sword would be comparing it to something like Blackblade Reforged. There's a couple other equipments that have a similar function of just make your creature huge. Sword of Truth and Justice is a bit slower in how it operates. Like, it's not just this big, +7, +10, however many number of lands you happen to have in play. However, if things start to go wrong, if someone casts a Vandal Blast, or if someone casts an Ixodron, the +1/+1 counters stay in play on the creature, so even if the sword doesn't stick around, that is actually a pretty big deal. And occasionally you do see things like Ixodron that flip your commander over, which are kind of a headache. Your creature will stay large with all those +1/+1 counters on it. So there is something to consider about that +1/+1 counters have more staying power than something like a Blackblade Reforged or whatever equipment you're using to just make your creature big. Now, if there's no artifact removal, then they'll probably play out fairly similar in function, but again, the protection from 2 colors is extremely relevant. So in a perfect world, I would probably slot this in over Blackblade Reforged if you are running a Blackblade Reforged. But again, that will also depend on the deck a little bit, so if you don't have easy access to Double Strike, then perhaps one of the other ones is better suited to what your commander is doing. In terms of where do I think this ranks with the other swords, I don't think it's as good as Feast and Famine, but again, like I said, there are points in a game where you just need other players dead. Feast and Famine doesn't necessarily help with that. It does help you to generate tons of mana and tons of value, though. In a pure Voltron deck, this may actually be better than Fire and Ice. Fire and Ice is very much a generate value kind of card. The 2 damage and the card draw are very nice, but I find that late in the game, if I still have cards in hand, I really don't go for Sword of Fire and Ice very often. I could see myself going to Sword of Truth and Justice much more if card draw isn't an issue at that moment in time. So right now, I don't know, it feels like for me it's coming in right behind Sword of Feast and Famine. There are times where you're probably going to want Fire and Ice over Truth and Justice. Again, if you're needing extra cards, if you need to generate value, if the protection colors are relevant, that sort of stuff, or if there's a creature on board that has 2 toughness and you really need to get rid of it, sure, Fire and Ice all day long. But yeah, I would say that this thing is probably right around Fire and Ice in terms of its playability. I think it's going to be much better than War and Peace because of the commander damage, especially if you're doing Voltron. And again, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about what proliferate in other colors means, so there might be some really interesting avenues there. I was actually a little bit underwhelmed reading this card initially. It wasn't until I actually pressed the record button on this video that I started thinking about what the damage math looks like if you put this thing on a Voltron creature, and that's when I started to be like, oh, wait a second. I think this thing's actually going to be pretty good. So anyway, just kind of wrapping things up, we got a new sword. I assume that means that they're doing the rest of the cycle of the swords. Super excited about that. Flavor and mechanic-wise, I feel like this one maybe is off the mark just a little bit. Feels a little bit more blue-green than it feels blue and white to me. In terms of overall power and playability, the protection colors are super relevant. This sword will be very good at killing people, but not so good if you need to generate value or need to generate card advantage. But will also work really well in decks where you need to proliferate. And then, like I mentioned, proliferating in other colors, I haven't thought about what that means, but there might be some really interesting possibilities there. So overall, I think it's going to be a pretty cool little sword, but what do you guys think? Is this sword going to replace Fire and Ice in your decks? Or which other equipment do you need to take out to slot this thing in? Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching.